Good morning and welcome to our webinar, the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, How to Claim. I am Emmanuel Clement, a Partnership Manager for the SEMLEP Growth Hub. SEMLEP is a public-private body whose role is to help economic growth thrive across the South East Midlands. But in this difficult time, we are focusing on supporting businesses through our business support team and webinars. During these webinars, we welcome your questions. So if you could please type them in the chat section only and not in the Q&A section, that would be great. If you have any experience of making a claim, we also will be pleased to hear your comments and feedback. Cash flow and financial support are the biggest concern for businesses, and the job retention scheme has been welcomed. Its eligibility has changed. It has been operational since Monday, and more than 140,000 UK companies have applied. To tell us about what it means to employees and how to claim is our guest speaker, Simon Parsons, who is Director of Payments, Benefits and Compliance Strategies at ST Works UK. Simon is a specialist in UK tax and social insurance legislation and all things payroll software development. He is also a member of a number of government consultation groups and panels which deal with the development and application of payroll impacting government policy within the United Kingdom. So, over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Let's just see if we can get the slides set open for you. Here we go. If I share that, let me know if you can see that, Emmanuel. That would be appreciated.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And welcome, everyone. It's good to be with you today and talking about the momentous occasion this week of being able to at least start making the coronavirus job retention scheme claims. This has been talked about now for over a month, since the 20th of March, and we're on to our 6th iteration of guidance. More guidance is due to be published today, and extensions of the online calculators as well. So it's very much a changing feat, but as indicated there, let me just get the connection working. There we go. I'll just start off with the disclaimer. I think I need to be able to provide that to you just in case. So this presentation does not provide definitive answers to individual queries, and in some places takes views on matters which are uncertain. It's not intended to be relied upon in any specific context or as a substitute for seeking advice, legal or otherwise, on a specific circumstance, as each case may be different. When you get a disclaimer like that, I think it's tends to be more of a trusted source. If you don't get disclaimers, then are you trusting it if you're not paying for it? There's all those sorts of angles to consider. But I'm not supervised or regulated in that respect. So the things that I say today are from my experience and opinion, although from an educated point of view. So today we're going to talk a little bit about, well, we'll catch up about the budget announcements and SSP leading into the coronavirus job retention scheme in relation to COVID-19, and predominantly 3 aspects. You could say there are 4, but I tend to cover 3 main ones. The 4th one is planet, not as in as a round thing with people on, but as in planning. Agree it, pay it, and claim it. And there are sort of 3-4 separate activities, and then we've got an opportunity for you to ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them, or a point in the direction of where you can find relevant information. As Manuel said, I'm the director at SD Works. SD Works is one of the largest payroll software suppliers in the United Kingdom and in Europe, formerly known as, before SD Works, name Ceridian or Centrefile, which was part of NatWest Bank. I also am a director of my own business, which is called Pay Advice, where you'll find I can actually react very quickly in getting blogs and things. So if you want to look there, payadvice.blog.home, or sorry, it's the other way around, payadvice.home.blog or payadvice.uk will get you there. So things are really complicated. It's been very complex leaving the EU, having a very late budget, a change of government. It's been very difficult for business to actually understand and plan for the future of what's going on. And then we've got the surprise of COVID-19 hitting us suddenly and impacting us to the extent that we're all working home. Our hair's all a little bit longer. We're probably growing beards for the males, and only dressing ourselves up for webinars. Apart from that, going around in bare feet. So it's a very interesting time, but so many of us are working at home, and others are probably finding that they haven't got much to do because there isn't any work for them to do. So the budget was held on the 11th of March, and the opening statements are about supporting us through COVID-19. If only we knew what that had meant probably at the time of what was to come. So there were changes immediately announced in relation to statutory sick pay and benefits becoming readily available for those impacted by the virus, and rights being extended on statutory sick pay, which have actually been extended now to those shielding as well. So I'm not going to go too much into the SSP side, as we're really here about the coronavirus job retention scheme, but only to say that sickness is available even if people are not sick. If it's related to COVID-19, they need to get themselves an NHS isolation note, maybe if you require it, but do you? And for first 7 days, you don't need any medical proof that someone's ill. After that, you can, but you don't need to necessarily. But if they are in related to COVID-19, they can just get online an isolation message which comes through. Some questions have been asked about it, about what about people on long-term sickness, what happens with maternity, etc., because there are potential rights for an employer to place someone on maternity leave earlier if they have maternity-related illness. Well, COVID-19 isn't maternity-related illness, so you can't place someone on maternity leave earlier just because they have absence because of COVID-19. So, and also for many of you, if you're small businesses, just to make you aware that if you do have anybody that's unable to work due to COVID-19, you can actually reclaim 100% of the SSP. The facility for doing that seems to be been parked to one side, so we don't really see that much at the moment of what to do. All the rules changed, commenced back to the 13th of March, apart from the shielding, which is effective. Shielding being treated as sickness is effective from 16th of April. You know, how do we make this reclaim? No idea at the moment, only that we know it will be a standalone reclaim system available at some point to get back 2 weeks sickness for those who are paying it to their employees. So let's see where it goes in the future on sickness, but we seem to have been taken over by the other provisions that came in announced on the 20th of March, which was the coronavirus job retention scheme, similar scheme for self-employed people to receive 8% of their regular wage up to a limit of £2,500 per month, with grants for at least 3 months. Well, the grant extension has been extended to end of June. So that was announced earlier that now this extension doesn't, the grant doesn't stop being available at the end of May, but it's been extended 1 more month. So there are the 3 aspects of furlough or CJRS, whatever we want to call it, are an element of agree it. Sometimes employers may think, well, this is just a government scheme, I can just put anyone on it, don't need to ask them, don't need to do anything, I can stop life. And reality is you can't. It's actually an agreement. So you need an agreement with your employees to furlough them. And I'm sure this has been covered on some of the webinars that you've attended already. So agree it. Agree the new terms. And you could say, what happens if they don't agree to it? Well, if they don't agree to it, potentially they're going to be laid off. So there is an element of, you'll probably find that most employees would want to agree to it, because the alternative is to be have no income at all and be reliant on state benefit. So there are beneficial means there. However, just be wary that the employment contract does keep going. They are still employed, although they're not permitted to work for the 21-day minimum. And so just make sure you keep a record of the agreements you make, and be careful with regards to benefits, pensions, because you have obligations, apprenticeship levy, etc. So it is, lots of people thought in the early days, or some did, that actually this meant the government would be paying them. And if I talk about my Belgium colleagues in SD Works, they have what they call temporary unemployment. So for their equivalent scheme, the government actually pay benefits to the employees direct. In the UK, the CJRS, or Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, is a grant process to your business. So the government are actually not paying your employees anything. They're giving you as a business a grant to pay them. So you pay the money and apply for the grant. And the grant basis is on 80% of their regular earnings. And that has to be paid regardless as a cash amount. You can take employee deductions, pension contributions for that, student loan, tax, national insurance. Those can all be deducted, but there are certain things that can't. So I'll probably cover some of those elements with you. So who can apply for the Corona Job Revirus scheme? If I'm a very profitable business and we have got some reserve, can we still apply for the grant? Well, if your employees would be impacted by COVID-19 because you've got no work for them, and so therefore they're potentially facing layoff or redundancy, the scheme is open to you. It's open to everyone. There is no financial qualification of being applicable for this scheme, apart from you've got a business in the UK, you have a UK PAYE scheme, and you have a UK bank account. How much grant is it? 8% based on the earnings reported, plus associated employers' NICs, and you can get back pension contributions as well based on the minimums, not what you normally contribute necessarily, but on the minimums the government will assist you with. The duration of the scheme, as I say, has been extended to the 30th of June, so it starts out 1st of March. The individual must not work for 21 days minimum consecutively. You can't have them come in for a couple of days and go home for a couple of days and come in for a couple of days. It is a 21-day non-working situation, although they can train, but you have to take some care. So pay it. The pay it aspect, because some will see that the claim is being paid, but actually it may not be. The pay it aspect is you need to decide what value of money you're actually paying to individuals, and it has to be at least the 8% earnings grant claim that you pay. And generally that's based on the last regular payment up to the 19th of March, that should say, not the 19th of April, just spotted that. So it's the last regular payment up to the 19th of March. For variable paid people, where the earnings fluctuate, is the average over the past 12 months, or if higher, the same period last year. So you can base it on last year. What happens about pay rises, what happens about national minimum wage, etc., they're really not applicable. The government aren't ensuring pay rises or national minimum wage, because in relation to furloughed employee, they actually have no work time at all. So there is actually no minimum wage due. So what is due is 8% at least of their regular earnings, whether that's above, below, whatever, it makes no difference, because in relation to national minimum wage, there is no earnings for national minimum wage. And then it's proportioned, and some people are confused. So there'll be an experience this week of people going on to the claim that the calculation basis is different. So some people may say they've had 10 working days left in this period that I furloughed, so I'll pay them 10 days. Whereas the government calculations and grants is based on a lapse time in the calendar month. So they may say, well, your 10 days is actually 13. In reality, so the calculation comes out different. So just be careful with that. And you may have mixed pay periods as well because of furlough. You've got weeklies, fortnightlies, monthly paid frequency type people. It is a single claim for the scheme for each claim period that you're doing. So it's a bit harder when you're mixing and matching. In inform the payroll what you want paid, because the payroll aspect is paying the amounts you've said. So what are the payroll requirements? They're very little, actually. All they need to know is an amount, and they will deduct tax, national insurance, student loan, postgraduate loans, anything else that's due, even attachment of earnings orders, although DEAs from the DWP have been suspended to the end of March. Other attachment of earnings orders or earnings arrestments still continue. The employer is liable for any top up above the furlough grant amounts. So if you've done it on a different basis than the grant will provide, you have to pay at least the grant amount claims. But if that was a little bit more, then the little bit more becomes the employer's responsibility. And also they still have employment rights, so accruing or continuing through the furlough period. So they're still an employee. So unless you've varied that as part of your furlough agreement, still entitled to the use of any benefits they had before, childcare vouchers, enhanced pension contributions, company car use, etc. So that's just being careful of what you've done. And the apprenticeship levy amount also is an employer cost. I thought I'd cover salary sacrifices as the hot topic, one of the most highest spoken of or questioned areas, because generally people don't understand the relationship of what a salary sacrifice is. People think that they can buy childcare vouchers, tax and NI free, they can buy pension contributors without national insurance, and the reality is you can't. So this is sort of a I'll pat your back, you pat my back type arrangement, where with a salary sacrifice, someone agrees to take a pay cut. So they've never earned the money. In return, the employer provides free of charge an alternate benefit, which might have roughly an equal value to the amount of the pay cut that was taken. So the big challenge here under coronavirus job retention scheme, of course, is that the HMRC or the government are compensating people for declared earnings, and so the pre-salary sacrifice amount is not declared earnings, it's the post-salary sacrifice amount. And so people may say, oh, well, that means I can cancel the salary sacrifice agreement and we can put that up the earnings to what they originally were. And you can't, because it's happened. You can't do salary sacrifice adjustments retrospectively. They always work for the future, never for the past. And so it has to have been arranged already. So it makes no difference to the furlough basis of earnings. And also, unless your furlough agreement says otherwise, you're on the hook for continuing the provision of the childcare and the extra pension, because that was the contractual arrangement in the salary sacrifice, so that we as employers could save the 13.8% NIC contribution, which we have over the period of years that we've operated them. And so I've given a little example of a 5% salary sacrifice that's in place where the employee is not contributing. They've decided to take a pay cut of 5% for the employer to make that 5% contribution to their pay. If you did that on furlough pay, it would be too low, because furlough pay is already reflecting the sacrifice that exists. So to find out what the notional pay associated with that would be, is you divide it by 100 minus the salary sacrifice 5% times 100, and you've got a slightly higher notional pay. Apply the 5%, make that into the employer contribution, and you're back down to the same furlough payment that has to be paid. Otherwise, you fall foul of breaching the grant conditions, because it is a grant to the business, which has to be reflected in your business accounts, etc., that you've received that grant. So this week, Monday, the service opened, 20th of April. It was open about 7:30, maybe 7:15. Officially, it opened at 8 o'clock. And within the first half hour, there were 68,000 applications that went through. The data here is probably a little bit higher than Emmanuel's announcement, because she'll be taking it, but this was announced late last night. Up to the 21st of April, there were 309,000 employers that actually made applications. Well, well, that equates to 285,000 businesses, accounting to 2.6 billion pounds of grant, affecting 2.2 million UK employees, which is reaching up towards the 10% of the UK workforce, a little bit lower than that, but getting there fairly rapidly. There's an element of the service is open and appears to be working well. Dare say, I'll tell you a little bit of secret. This all appears to be automatic online. I'd suggest to you that actually the data is all being manually keyed in tax office locations. So claim it. Who will do it? And that's the big question. So if you've got a grant claim to make, you may need to do it yourself, or you may have a tax filing agent that can do it for you. But just make you aware that often payroll bureaus, e-filers that do your RTI FPS submissions may not be able to do it because they're not authorized to. So you do need to sign in using a government gateway account. If you don't have one, verify who can do it for you, or apply for one now. So if you go to the government gateway, you can actually apply, and they have a much expedited route for getting login capability to you very quickly. If you're wanting your claim money before the end of this month, the deadline for it, unfortunately, was midnight last night. So payments applied for today will be for the 1st of May. So potentially they're taking 6 days for claims to go through. You could chance it and see if it will come through faster, but there's an element of work out what data, what claims you're needing, and away you go. So claim it. How much? And pay it and claim it are two different things. They're two different activities. So I know a lot of employers are trying to make sure that the payroll calculation equals the grant application. I'd suggest that that's a near impossible task. There will be at least differences to an extent, even if they're small. That's because the calculation of pay under PAYE is different to the calculation of the grant application. Very different in some respects. So don't expect them to match exactly, but they will match closely, and which means that employers may have to top up small amounts in all cases, may only be pence in relation to a number of claims, so you may only have a £2 extra top up, but that would be a business expense for doing that. So there are a claim calculator available. It's being expanded. It was meant to have been expanded yesterday, but I've not seen that it has been. So at the moment, it will do an online calculation for you to work out for standard regular earnings, those on like a salary position, or they have a fixed contract with a fixed number of hours and get the same money each week. The variable calculator is not quite there on the government website yet. All right, so part period coverage are causing complexities. So there's an element of what issues are people seeing. The National Insurance Employers NIC calculation is different to the liability under PAYE, but they're close. And the pension subsidy isn't related to your scheme rules. It's related to the minimum required for pensions auto-enrolment, which is 3% banded. So if you're more generous as an employer or have salary sacrifice arrangements, the top-ups elements are your cost. So be aware of that. So it's 3% banded. Lots of people operate from £1, and they may even have schemes where they have to contribute 4%. You will only get 3% banded to reclaim. It's the same for everyone if they are in the pension scheme. So how the calculator works is you give it the gross amount to be furloughed. It will work out the employer national insurance, the employer minimum auto enrolment pension costs, and it will give you the breakdown for different periods depending on the parameters that you've put in. And you need to then tally that up for the claim. Not really anything to do with payroll, this, apart from payroll has to have at least paid the furlough earnings amount, at least. You can't pay less. But the other values are sort of different, independent. tally them all up for your claim process and keep records. There is a requirement within the law, the emergency law for COVID-19, that you must keep records, because potentially this will be audited by HMRC at some point in the future, because the unfortunate thing is, with a lot of emergency measures and grant process, there are criminals out there who will try to take advantage of schemes to get money. And I tended to find myself, the day of lockdown, I received about 10 to 15 calls telling me about problems with my broadband, pensions, car crashes. All these sorts of things just suddenly started to flood in until I reported the numbers calling to the BT malicious call helplines, and they seem to have suddenly stopped. So just be aware, there are scams. NHS workers are being contacted about joining various schemes. People are being offered tax refunds via text, which look as if they come from the HMRC, but don't. Okay, so there is a guide, a step-to-step guide provided by HM Government, which talks you through the essential information, what you need to do before you make the claim, the basis of calculation, because you do this by spreadsheet. The calculation is not the same as your payroll result, how to make the claim and what to do next following that. The provision is that if you log in, click on the various elements, you will get your grant money within 6 days. So the view here is shown is from an agent point of view, because I am an agent, so I don't have it from an employer, but I imagine it's very similar, that you'll find that there is a link saying read more about job retention scheme, and then telling you how. It'll make you accept and continue a statement, because they're obviously concerned that people may try to be fraudulent or abusive in the way they're claiming, and elevate new starters that weren't really new starters, or employed there, or values that are different. And actually there's even a fraud line for employees to report employers if they believe that they've not received the 80% due if they've agreed to a furlough agreement. And so there is an element of risk of fraud. And then you can click on the right at the top there, it's got coronavirus job retention. Underneath it would be the claim. Click on that and it'll start taking you through these series of questions, asking you, have you furloughed, what dates, what your claim is, etc. If you're under 100 employee business, which many of you may be, then you need to have been registered on PAYE online. You need to have your bank details, your PAYE scheme, the number of employees being furloughed. Now, there are some checks, because they'll check to see how many employment records were already on file. You can't exceed it. So if they didn't have a record number of that people that you're now claiming for, you'll find that it just won't go through. And then you provide each employee's national insurance number. There is an issue with the online claim, to the extent that if you don't have a national insurance number, it won't let you do it on the under 100s. But there is a helpline you can call, and they will help you and assist you manually. But they're asking that you get the proper national insurance number, and then you need to apply the employee's payroll or employee number, which is optional, the start and end of the claim for the scheme, and the full amounts you're claiming. So there is some employee information, but very light. This is a scheme claim. If you're putting 100 or more employees in, there is a file layout or a file format. You can have 4 different types, generally Excel, CSV, or ODS, that you can put in a spreadsheet of details, but there's slightly more detail. It's full name of the individual, national insurance number, payroll number, furlough start and end for them. If they haven't ended and it's continuing, just leave it blank. The full amount you're claiming for this period, and away you go. Just be careful with the under 100. If you're 99 employees, unlucky. Because that's quite a lot of keying to key 99, and presently the service will only stay open for 15 minutes. If you don't get the, you get to employee 97 and the 15 minutes is up, you'll find the page expires and you have to start again, and just be a bit quicker. So it's having a little bit of a speed typist there available to do They won't let you do a file for the under 100, but what they do promise is that the turnaround of grant is quicker. I think what happens with the over 100 is they're not actually dealing with the file electronically. It's actually probably going to a print center who then keying it in for you somewhere else through the HMRC systems. But this has been turned around in 4 weeks. Here's a Claim It data format sample. There is one available. If it's needed, just let me know, and we can point you in a direction. There's a recruitment agency for payroll that have uploaded it onto their site. This was provided by the software development support team at HMRC to the British Computer Society. I chair the payroll specialist group there, showing the type of format. The important detail that's actually needed on the upload is not the top and the bottom bits, because those will be asked, but the middle on the employee details, employees NINO, number, payroll reference, employee furlough start end, and the claim amount that's applicable for that individual, including the employer's NI and the pension contribution as well. So Claim It continuing, no NINO. The response from HMRC, they came out with this yesterday, because initially it was looking as if you had no NINO, you couldn't get any grants. They've changed the view there. If you don't have a national insurance number, you can get the grant. So if you have an over 100, you can actually leave the field blank. It was originally compulsory, but now it's optional. And if you have under 100, the online service will still insist. So you find you can't make the claim, in which case they give a telephone helpline, 0800 024 1222, who will process the claim for you over the phone. How very convenient. That might make it easier for some to say, actually, I'll use the phone service instead of the online. But you may find you still need to have had an online account. So HMRC do offer assistance. They say they can help you. They prefer not to be called. I think it's a little troublesome for them, but there is also online communications via web chat. So you can do it online or via web chat or on the phone on 0800 024 1222. Okay, so I think we're at a point, Emmanuel, that if there are any questions we'd like to take, we can do that. Just to say that I'm running another little webinar next week. Hope you don't mind me advertising that, but which is open and free to anybody that wants to join it. But hopefully these ones with yourselves at SEMLEP are fantastic, and you get the information and support. There's a lot of support out there. There is a lot. Just be aware, though, things change daily.
Okay, that's great. Many thanks, Simon. We have some questions, so I'm going to fire away. We've got a business with a limited company, and they are the only employee. They take dividends, but can't claim any business support. Does the person need to claim as an employee through job retention?
Well, you can claim as a director. If you're a director of your business, I'm a director of my own business. I'm not saying that because I'm working, because there are a couple of conditions with directors. Is you can't work for the profit of the business, but you can undertake statutory duties. So some of you will have accounts to file and statements to make, continuation statements to the company's house. You can do all of that type of activity. That's perfectly allowed. So any statutory activity is allowed, but you can't go around selling things and generating and actually doing any work. But you can furlough yourself. You need to make a board resolution to furlough the director. So type a minute and put it in your book of minutes that you're required to hold by the company's house, that you have open potentially for inspection if needed, unless you're part of the electronic system that people want. So minute that, and you can. Your challenge is, what have you declared as your income? And I think there's a little bit of a clue in there that you've mentioned dividend. So sometimes when we're operating our own business, we've actually indicated to HMRC in our returns that we haven't earned very much at all, in which case our furlough payment grant is 80% of not very much at all, because dividend is not employment income. It's a payment to the shareholders from the profits of the business and is not treated as employment income. I know there's lots of debates and lobbying going on in the House, and sometimes it's portrayed as outstanding questions, but so far, actually from the beginning, the Chancellor has been fairly clear that dividends are not part of furlough. And that makes sense to a certain extent, but not necessarily good news for us, because if I've got a shareholding of, I don't know, 10,000 shares in British Airways, but I'm not a director or an employee, I just have a shareholding, and they're not going to be able to afford to pay me dividends anymore, would the government subsidise that? And I think it's just being careful with that. And we could say we've probably constructed our business in such a way to be tax efficient. That efficiency may mean that we've restricted ourselves in how much furlough, but you can furlough and get 8% of what you actually declared to HMRC as your income under your contractor service for your own business. Hope that helps, Emmanuel. I don't think it's necessarily good news for people, but actually the Chancellor would be quite rightly turning around and say, you're covered by the scheme.
Excellent. Thank you, Simon. We've got a few questions. Can I furlough a member of staff because they need to shield, or can they only have SSP?
You can furlough a member of staff that has to shield. And law was changed it came into force on the 16th, so it was passed on the 15th under emergency law. Before that, shielding was not sickness, but it falls into other areas. So if someone's been told to shield, it's just a consideration. If they refuse to come to work, some employment laws would indicate that you don't need to pay them. But if they came to work, what would your employer's liability insurance cover? Because they've actually been instructed to stay at home. So how are you going to make them safe? Because that would be the obligation. And I'm aware of a number of people related who were actually sent home by their employer. If you're sent home because you've received an instruction to shield and you can't make the premises, you've actually put them on medical suspension. So medical suspension is 100% earnings for 26 weeks. So there's a difference of what happens there. And you could say what happens with a 0 hours worker, because if 100% of earnings as a 0 hours worker would be zero, so they wouldn't get anything. So the law's been changed so that some people that are shielded, it is now counted as unfit for work, and they would be entitled to statutory sick pay under the usual test. You would only get the reclaim back for the first 2 weeks. Anything after that, because quite often the letter is telling them to shield for a minimum of 12 weeks, they would be entitled to the SSP, but you couldn't reclaim it. It would be at the cost of the employer. So there's a couple of aspects there, but you can furlough them. So those that would be under medical suspension, you could offer them furlough and they just be furloughed along with everybody else. Otherwise, it's SSP from the 16th of April onwards.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Can a team member request to be furloughed due to being unable to maintain social distancing while at work?
They can request it. You don't have to accept it. So any furlough is by agreement. It's not enforced. And some of you will see in some of the social media debate about people that work for umbrellas or agencies. And you can't force them. The scheme is actually open to be used, but it's not a one-sided scheme. It's a two-sided scheme. So if one party won't agree, you can't furlough. So they can certainly request it, and if you want to meet that request, then fine, because you can get the grant for them. And you know, or are they just being a bit funny? Am I allowed to say that sort of thing? Sometimes it's an employment issue, isn't it? Yeah. So is it genuine, or are they swinging the lead?
Okay, thank you. Do the Easter bank holidays impact the number of days for the furlough period?
No, they don't, because the requirement of, unless they were worked. So the requirement of furlough is that time has not been worked for 21 days. The fact that some of those may be holiday does not make any difference as long as they weren't working. And the same a little bit with sickness and maternity leave, etc. There's a question of have they worked. So as long as there's a period of 21 days of non-work, should be fine. However, there are consequences with bank holidays if you're actually paying them as holiday, and that is under the Working Time Directive, Employment Rights Act, they're entitled to an average of their normal pay or 52 weeks of actual pay weeks, discount any 0 weeks. So you can't pay 80% of their pay for a holiday day. You have to pay 100%. And that top up would be a cost to the employer. So what some employers will do, and there's a good page on the ACAS site, is they may actually say excuse me, let's defer the holiday to a future point in time. That way the extra costs is moved to the future, but it's your choice to a certain extent. So I just need to take a mouthful there. I was getting a bit of a throat.
It'd be good to see you, Simon.
Yes. Oh, do you want me to sit? I can put on the camera.
If that's okay.
Let's try it for you. Let's see if it will let me. How do I switch? I just start video. That will do it. Yes. Is that all right?
Right. Yes.
Can you see me? Okay.
Thank you.
So you could actually defer the holiday to a future point. In other words, they were a furlough day themselves, in which case you just pay them the 80% and get your reclaim. The Working Time Directive, because I was discussing this with a colleague, because I'm part of a Belgian parent company, SD Works, Social, I never remember what the D stands for, but it's Social Security in Flemish, because it's a sort of a government quango over there. In Belgium, they're subject to the Working Time Directive as stipulated by the European Union. Of course, we've enshrined European law into British law, but the government have amended it because we're no longer members of the European Union. So the Working Time Directive requires you to have your 4 weeks holiday each year, and if the employee fails to take it, they lose it. But the UK Working Time Directive regulations have been amended so that any unused holiday for this holiday year can, by agreement, be carried forward to the next 2 years, so it's not lost. So I think there's an element of looking at what your options are. You can actually enforce holiday on employees. If you want them to take holiday, you have to give them twice the notice of the length of the holiday you're asking them to take. So if you wanted someone to take 1 day off, you have to let them know at least 2 days before. If you wanted them to take a week off, you have to let them know prior to 2 weeks before. So just be careful. But if you do take holiday, you have to top up to what their full pay would be. Otherwise, you've breached holiday pay law.
Okay.
Hope that helps.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, thank you. Can you wait for your claim to be paid before paying your employees, even if it's after your normal payday?
I'm going to say simply yes, you can if you really need to. The intention of the scheme is for you to carry on and get a grant, and I think that's why the deadline was in for yesterday. But many of you will have had situations where the grant claim wasn't available until last Monday, and you'll have paid already, and your coffers may be a little bit dry. So where are you going to fund it? So in effect, you could, in arrears, pay it. But you have to, and you'll find that as part of the agreement, you are agreeing that whatever you receive, you will pay. Otherwise, they will come and ask for it back. That's the government. So you can't knock off a bit, etc. It's if you claimed £100, you pay £100. Is that a little bit later than normal payday? I'd suggest that's not what the government really want you to do, but you can. Okay,
thank you. Overtime is not guaranteed. So you're paying staff who are furloughed 80% of their basic salary and no overtime. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. So the guarantee is not necessarily the important thing. I think it's more the regularity. I was just thinking if I could go and look up the actual wordings they say on the earnings amount, which might give a clue. And they have actually changed it, because initially when they announced it, they said that you couldn't include commission, but regular commission you can. But anything that's considered regular, I think this kind of falls a little bit in with the holiday pay law of what is considered regular. And there was a ruling last summer in the Court of Appeal where someone was kind of saying, well, this isn't guaranteed holiday, but it was so regular that the judge ruled that what's the difference. And so just be a bit careful with overtime, but it's for you as an employer to judge and say, and remember, you're getting a grant application. So you could, if it was so regular, and this is where the variable average pay calculation can come into play, to think that, well, actually people are getting, you know, £200 this week, 500 the next, 400 the next, that you actually go into an averaging or the same period last year for the basis of the furlough payment. Okay. So bit troubled with the word guarantee.
Okay, thank you. Can the business continue to trade partially applying for furlough grant?
It can, but not partially with an individual, if that makes sense. So if there's 3 of you in the business and 2 of you are furloughed, the other one can continue working. Yeah. But they have to continue, but the other 2 have to be furloughed for a period of 21 days. And you could cycle it. So you could say this person work 2 weeks while someone furloughs for 21 days. And then after 7 days, you furlough another one. You see what I mean? You can do sort of a rotation as long as the individual is not working for 21 days. So you can have people that are not furloughed alongside people that are furloughed who are at home.
Okay, and then the business choose who they want furloughed and who they don't.
That's right. And part of your furlough agreement should probably have a clause to indicate you may want them to come back at fairly short notice, actually. But you would outline the furlough terms, because under the law presently, unless you've got an exclusivity clause, and lots of those actually aren't valid anyway, so you can't have an exclusivity clause for a 0 hours worker. The law forbids you. And if you do have an exclusivity clause in a 0 hours worker contract, it's invalid. It wouldn't stand in a court anyway. That actually someone on furlough could go and get another job.
Okay, thank you. We've got somebody who went through the calculator, and it says that you cannot yet claim if you are doing a top-up to an employee, but this will launch soon. So what do they enter in the claim? 80% or wait?
You can enter 8%. Yes, you don't have to. The calculator itself doesn't have the capability. It's meant to have done yesterday afternoon. So if you hang on, it might be there today. Have to see if you want it, but you don't have to use the government's calculator at all. If you look in the claim for your employer wages through Corona Job Retention Scheme, a step-by-step guide for employers, it outlines the formula calculation that you make. But in effect, if they've been employed for a full calendar month and you're furloughing them, it's 8% of the regular earnings, or the average, or the higher of a year ago. So you can actually say to the claim machine the value to use. But you're right, the online government calculator can't handle it yet. Okay. That doesn't mean you can't claim it, though. You could work it out other means.
Yeah. And furlough, as you said, is a minimum of 20 calendar days.
21, yes. 21, so it's 3 weeks.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, doesn't necessarily have to all be. So you could have someone returning from sickness. Yeah, as long as they've been absent for 21 days, you're good.
Okay, thank you. We've got some more questions who came through the Q&A section. Yeah. We have a layoff clause in our contract. We are a nursery business and have recently heard for childcare settings that are in receipt of 3-4-year-old funding, we may not be able to claim the 80% that other employees may receive under the furlough scheme. We only have a handful of employees that we may consider furloughing. It seems an awful lot of work for a few. Can we just lay off instead of furloughing?
You've always got that choice to lay off instead of furlough. That's right. You don't have to, furlough is not compulsory. It's just an encouragement of the government. But this is a difficulty, especially for part-funded public money, because the government's view on public funding is they've not cut the funding. So it's because the nursery is closed down, you won't not get your voucher money. You will. You know, they're still paying the grant for the looking after the child, even if you're not. The problem with certainly nurseries and other, even in the public sector, sort of support companies is they're not 100% public. So they've got a little bit of public and private business. And so there is an element of, you can furlough whoever you want, but they would expect you to apportion what relates to public and private. And with public identified individuals, the government's view is you've already got 100% of the money. In fact, their preference is that you'd actually pay them full wage. But those that you kind of assigned as being private, you can claim the 8% back. It's a muddle, isn't it? Because that makes it very complicated, especially for you've got premises still to pay. So whether you've got 20 children and 10 are publicly funded, the rent's still going to be the same, isn't it? Although there are certain reliefs and grants available that that you can have as well. So some of those on costs or overheads should be reduced for you. But I feel for it because many are very small. So it's not as if you've got a vast quantity of staff. It's when you've got 100, it's not such a big hit. When you've got 10, that could be quite devastating.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a business with a bakery who's closed at the moment, and it's a partnership between a couple, and they furloughed 8 of their staff and are planning to claim through the scheme. Can they claim anything for themselves?
It depends on how they're designated within the business, but I would suspect yes. So if it's a limited business and they're directors, they can certainly furlough. But if they're paying themselves money and that was under PAYE, then you can furlough yourselves, yes. But
Okay.
just be careful, you can't undertake business. So sometimes I think there's this sort of, well, I'm at home, so I can phone up everyone and generate for the future when we're open. And actually, you're working, so you'd be breach of the grant.
Okay, thank you. Can a business do their own PAYE, even if it's always been done by their accountant?
Oh, definitely. Yes. And you can certainly make your own claim. If we stick with furlough, you don't have to have your accountant do it. You can do it yourself, but you may need to register to do that. But lots of businesses have their own access to their own employer PAYE account to see the accounts, etc. Agents have a very different view. So although an accountant may be registered for you, they can't see all the information that an actual employer would have. And someone was trying to point out to me on LinkedIn that everyone would have online PAYE. And I understand what they mean, because when I registered my business, I had to do online corporation tax. That doesn't mean I have PAYE online, although it is an option if I click it. But I then have to register a PAYE scheme, and I don't actually have any employees that have employment income. But that's talking about my little business. I actually am a full-time employee for SD Work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anything that says how long you need to re-employ your staff after furloughing?
There isn't, no. But I think there's sort of an ethical view of what's the intention. So the intention of the scheme isn't to cover redundancy or anything like that. So they are with you, but at the end of furlough, you may need to go through a layoff or redundancy because the business can't survive or has to come back. So yes, there is no requirement to say they've got to be employed for another 6 months or anything. You could actually go straight into a layoff routine at the end of furlough if you so desired. But the encouragement, of course, from the government is to retain jobs if we can. But there's economic realities we've got to face, especially as, you know, the original expectation this all finishes in May and we're all back to normal. Now it's been extended to June. How long can people survive?
Yeah. We've got a business who pay on a monthly basis, and this month was a 5-week month. Can they claim for the 5 weeks or only 3 at a time?
You can claim for the 5 weeks, yes, but the end date of the claim period cannot be more than 3 weeks in advance. So assuming you're paying at the end of the 5 weeks, towards the end of the 5 weeks, then 3 weeks before that payment date, you can put in your claim for 5 weeks. In fact, you can claim longer, because your claim now can go back to 1st of March. And the indication from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs is that the claim mechanism will be open at least for 2 years. That doesn't mean that furlough is going on for 2 years, but people may have furloughed now, but be surviving, and then in a year's time decide, okay, now we'll make the claim, and you can, if you went through the legal furlough process.
Okay, thank you. The bakery business we talked about earlier, it's actually a partnership. It's not a limited business.
Right, yeah, partnerships can. So there is guidance on partnerships. Let's see if I can just see if I can. It's a question of whether I've got the paperwork to hand. But partnerships, yeah. The question is, do you actually divide money as a partnership and pay it as earnings on an RTI FPS submission? So the real critical point is furlough is actually available pretty much to everyone as long as you've been returning an earnings income to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs on an RTI FPS submission. So you find office holders, partners, directors, even some will say they call themselves self-employed, but they're not. It gets very difficult. I think one of the slides at the beginning, it probably had the deals. There is a self-employed scheme, and some say, I'm self-employed, I'm not covered by that scheme, but they're not self-employed. As a director of my own business, I'm not self-employed. Yeah, I'm a director of the business. And so, and others will say, well, self-employed people are being caught by IR35. Well, actually, self-employed people can't be caught by IR35. IR35 catches people who actually work for a business, but it might be their own business, but they're still an employee of their business. Sometimes I think there's an element of when you operate a limited company, it's quite clear in the documentation you see from Companies House, there is separation between the business and an individual. But sometimes we think in our head, because we are the sole worker for that business, it's all one. It's not. It has two parts. It has a company and an individual. But check, because it depends on the type of partnership, and have you actually been submitting earnings to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs under RTI. If you're actually considered self-employed, then you'll have been making a return. You could potentially qualify under the self-employed model.
These people actually, this couple actually self-assess and they take drawings.
Yeah, may have to see, because it is a question of whether it's seen as employment income.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of more questions. Does it make any difference if you're operating as a charity to apply for the scheme?
No, charities can apply. It's open to anybody that's operating a POI scheme.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, some people have had trouble because in the original design, it was asking for compulsory data, which was things like your corporation tax number or your unique tax reference, or I can't remember what the other one is offhand, but there were 3 items that it was asking for, and you had to provide answers to one of them. For certain instances, and the charity may be there, you don't have one. But it's been adapted so that you can actually just ignore the questions. You just keep on saying no, no, no. Other people worry because they think they have to supply all three, because they might actually have all three. You actually only need to supply one if you have it. If you supply one, it won't ask you the other questions.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, open to charities.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Can business ask furloughed employees to carry out maintenance on the premises on a voluntary basis?
I'd suggest no.
Okay.
What you might want to do is get together with a couple of other premises and see if you could swap volunteers. Did I say that? I'll deny it. But in effect, you're running dodgy ground if you're actually having them do anything on a voluntary basis. You may actually be breaching national minimum wage law as well.
Okay. I've got a question, Simon. If you've had an employee furloughed and then you decide to open your business for 1 or 2 weeks, can you unfurlough them and then furlough them again?
You can, yes, but each period of furlough has to be for 21 days. There is the other aspect, is you can furlough anybody for any length. The question is, can you afford the 8%? Because the grants requirement is that it has to be for 21 days. Yeah, so I know of businesses that actually have furloughed people, but they're not applying for the grant at all. Okay. And probably because they can afford to, but although it'll be a hit to their books, but it was better than having to send everyone home and pay 100%, for example. That would have been even more of a hit. So yes, so you just think about that. You could return people earlier. You would just no longer be able to claim a grant for them. Okay. So yeah, multiple periods is fine, but each period has to be 21 days or more.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I think we've come to the end of our webinar. I hope we answered all your questions, but if you've got any feedback, any more questions, please email the Growth Hub. I believe you've seen forthcoming webinars on the landing page earlier. So when we're going to show you the detail of our business support line, if you need any further support. And I really would like to thank Simon for his time this morning and a very detailed presentation and thorough answers to your questions. I would like to thank you for your time and hope to see you again at one of our webinars.